Now, to announce the winner, Mr. Bill Scales, the Chancellor of Swinburne University of Technology, which has become a sponsor of this award, which is the richest in Australian journalism. Bill.
Thanks very much, Les. By unanimous decision, the winner is Neil Mitchell, 3AW and Herald Sun.
I believe that something stinks in Victoria at the moment. It smells badly. And I believe part of the doubt is coming out of one place you should really be able to trust, police headquarters. Now, at worst, ultimately, what's at risk here is your safety and the openness of the police, their willingness to be direct with you. Because today, I think there are very clear questions to be asked about apparent manipulation of crime figures covering the city.
Now, before you hear from Neil, who is currently making the transformation from Captain Grumpy to Mr. Mellow, I'll read you what the judges had to say. Neil Mitchell last year broke the story that led in a straight line to the resignation of Victoria's Chief Commissioner of Police. He exposed a serious new crisis in the health system. He wrote strong columns about both issues for the Herald Sun. He jousted spectacularly with the Prime Minister. He did a long interview with Australia's 3 living Victoria Cross winners that was memorable for its gentle teasing out of facts and feelings. And as always, he spent the year sticking up for ordinary people who otherwise might not have had a voice. As part of Neil's nomination, Laurie Oakes, who won this award last year, Laurie wrote, quote, "He breaks stories, he has good sources, he holds the powerful to account." Peter Blunden, the Managing Director of the Herald and Weekly Times, wrote, quote, "He never gives up until he gets results. That's what great journalism is all about." In judging the award, we also noted that Neil's performance in 2011 was no one-off event. Rather, it was typical of his 25 years on the air. Neil meets the defining criteria for this award, that the journalism be memorable and excellent. There is a third criterion. We're asked to look for work that Graham Perkin might have liked. There's no doubt that Graham would have applauded the Mitchell trademarks, an uncanny sense of audience, a hatred of humbug, and a belief that the only agenda is the story itself. So congratulations to you, Neil, and also to the other 6 on what was a very strong, short, long list. Thank you.
Thanks, Les. Don't worry about this. It's typed out in 48 point because I can't see. It won't go on that long. Ladies and gentlemen, judges, members of the Perkin family, thank you. I mean, it's weird, isn't it? As a journalist, you never actually get used to standing there hearing people say nice things about you. I think it's something to do with the job. In fact, this week my wife, in the manner of wives, managed to bring me back down to earth when we were talking about this. And she's pointed out that in 43 years in journalism, I started when I was just barely 17, which is absurd in itself. In 43 years, I could safely say I'd made more enemies than friends. And it's right, I've made some very good enemies, and a lot of them, and I've made a few very good friends. I'm very serious, as John Hamilton said, when I say I'm overwhelmed by this, and congratulations to the people on that long short list. There's some absolutely superb journalism in there, and I don't quite know why I've got the nod, but I'm humbled by it, another word John used. And I'm overwhelmed because of names. I mean, look at some of the names of the previous winners. Laurie Oakes, as Les said, Les himself, Andrew Rule, Cameron Stewart, Terry McCran, John Sylvester. And I'm also overwhelmed by a name like Graham Perkin. I worked under him for 6 years. He hired me as that 17-year-old Dill. I remember the interview, I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And I think I remained terrified of Graham for the whole 6 years. It was part of his act. He was a big man, he had a big voice, and he had a habit of using that voice, as John said, and John mentioned it being used in a bar in Perth. I heard it used around a newsroom often enough. He'd shout, "Jesus, chap!" That's when you'd stuff something up, usually. As in, "Jesus, chap, what were you thinking when you did that?" He smoked Camel cigarettes most of the time, as I recall. I think he probably smoked whatever was fashionable. Unfiltered, in the newsroom, at the back bench, and if you didn't smoke, you're a girl. You were allowed to smoke in those days, and you were allowed to be sexist. And he could do both. He drove at one stage a big red Jag. It was a bastard of a car, kept breaking down every week, but he loved it, and it was symbolic of what he was. He was a Melbourne supporter, God bless him. He thought that, yes, I agree, he thought that racetracks should be bulldozed and turned into something useful. He had a magnificent mistrust of authority and all politicians, and is without doubt one of the best leaders I've ever seen. I was only a kid, of course. I was only a kid when very much on the edge of it, but even I could understand that he was creating this environment where great journalism could flourish, and did. His reporters would have followed him anywhere because, well, one, he could himself do anything that he asked us to do, and he could do it a lot better than us. He knew what mattered to people, and you'd see him out in the newsroom. On the back bench, he'd be subbing and writing and reading those old proofs we used to get and shouting and he'd get excited about a police round story, for heaven's sake, which wasn't, even in those days, wasn't exactly the image of the age, and it's probably pretty unfashionable now. But he gave us, most importantly, I think, an ethical and professional framework to base our careers. The influence continued through people like Les and others who worked under Graham, and I think went on to mould generations of journalists in this country. But all those intimidating things about Graham Perkin that I remember as a kid came back to me this week. Mike Smith, another person who worked, in fact, Mike and I started on the same day at the Age. Mike found me a copy of a speech Graham made in February 1972. Now that's 40 years ago last month, 3 years and 8 months before his death. Now I read it and I immediately felt guilty. I felt he'd been looking over my shoulder at everything I'd done wrong in the past 25, 30 years. But this speech hit just every point, and John touched on it earlier, but every point that's so relevant to Australian journalism today. I'll ask the press club if they can put it on the website, because we all should read it. Just a couple of examples. This is from a speech 40 years ago. Quote, "If we are honest with ourselves, we must recognise a problem that plagues us all, the state of our public reputation." Still quoting. 40 years ago. "All sorts of amateur critics are having a field day at our expense, detecting real and imagined faults in our ethics and performance." Sound like Bob Brown, some of his mates? In this speech, Graham then mentioned Germaine Greer, for heaven's sake. It was only this week Germaine Greer was calling for the closure of newspapers. Used to be a bit entertaining, dear old Germs, but she's a bit of a sideshow these days. But this comes from Graham Perkin 40 years ago. That's not sexist, that's just editorial comment. And she is a sideshow. Quote, Graham Perkin 40 years ago, boo him. Quote, "Our critics range from Dr. Germaine Greer to the Commonwealth Attorney General, and at both limits of that range, I think we can afford to be contemptuous. But," and this is his key point, still quoting, "we ought to treat very seriously indeed the criticism of some of the people, ordinary readers, who fall between those two," unquote. He says the media, in this speech, the media is far from perfect, but it's infinitely better than what we'd get if the critics of the left or the right were permitted to impose their controls. He talks about our failings, about junk journalism, sloppy writing, dull layout, lazy, superficial journalism. That's when I thought he might have been looking over my shoulder. He talks about the reflex decision that news must always be sensational. And I love this quote from him. Quote, "If a man biting a dog guarantees page one space, The one thing in life that's certain is that some idiot will start biting dogs. And I'm starting to feel a bit guilty here. I can hear him over my shoulder saying, Jesus, chap, write your own stuff. I recommend his speech. Have a look. This man helped redefine papers against the challenge of television news and current affairs emerging in the 60s and 70s. And I reckon today he would love the challenge of the internet and some of the sloppy production line journalism that's at risk of encouraging. Now, I should say I love this business. From the age of 12, I wanted to play journalist, and I don't regret for a minute doing it. We need to celebrate it, we need to refine it, as well as criticise, and that's what tonight's about, the Quills. I'm also honoured to get this award for many reasons, but particularly it's the first time a radio journalist has got it, and after 25 years in the business, even though some still consider me a newspaper journalist, I think I can call myself a radio person. Radio's brutal. It's brutal and raw and magnificent because it keeps you in touch with your audience. You misread an issue and they tell you. I remember very early in my radio life, I was thundering on about some esoteric political matter and I was belting the desk and I gave this very impressive editorial. Give us a call, 96900 693, and the phones rang. First caller, yes, Bill. And Bill will say, yes, Neil, you're spot on. And his voice came on the line and said, Neil, get your hand off it. His words. And he was right. I had misread the audience and the issue, and they told me quickly. I remember another one, quick one. We campaigned pretty much alone about dodgy speed cameras in Melbourne on the Western Rig Road. Eventually, the state government repaid $26 million to people who had been wrongly booked. That campaign came from listening to our audience. One caller, wrongly booked in a Datsun 120Y, accused of doing 167 k's an hour. It wouldn't do that if you dropped it out of a jumbo. Everybody said we were wrong. The Premier, the Chief Commissioner, the audience kept saying we were right, and we listened. The other thing that sticks in my mind is the privilege of the job, and Les mentioned being able to sit down with 3 VC recipients, Keith Payne from Vietnam, Mark Donaldson from Afghanistan, Ben Robert-Smith from Afghanistan, and the time I spent with them before and during the interview, and I've maintained contact with all of them, is a great privilege for a person who was only there because they happen to have a microphone. Thanks for the award. It's the greatest honour I can imagine in journalism. I want to thank quickly my staff, Justin Smith, who's played a huge role in all this. His journalistic instincts are magnificent, and at least once a week he has the most intense shouting match with some spin doctor that's upset him. If we could tape Justin in full flight, I reckon we could sell tickets to it. But his counsel's invaluable. Stephen Beers, our technician, who's got me to air from the beach at Gallipoli, the foot of the Washington Monument, seedy hotel in Istanbul, which was actually called the Hotel Ali Baba, and it was run by thieves. From Changi, he even managed to save me from being massacred by some madman out at an OB we did at a shopping centre once when we had to do those things to make money. Thanks to my junior producers, Seb Costello, Kushla Travis, both of whom have got great futures. And I want to thank my family quickly. You don't construct a career in journalism without bruising your family. My wife, Selena, who's been there every step of the way, still describes him as her first husband, even after 30 years of marriage, I'm not sure, I'm afraid. My kids, who missed a lot and put up with a lot because of me. Kel, my daughter, who in prep grade managed to injure her eye just at the time I was at war with teachers about a pay rise, and she was sitting in the sick bay crying and told by the teacher, well, now you're going to be as one-eyed as your dad. We changed schools. Or my son Cam, aged 4, had the honour of hanging up on Bob Hawke. Bob had called me at home one Saturday morning. It was just after he'd lost the Prime Ministership and he wanted to abuse me about something, and Cam just told him that I was far too busy and hung up on him. And then told me a couple of hours later, some bloke called Bomb had called for me. Bomb somebody. So you lose the Prime Ministership and then you're hung up on by a 4-year-old. I'd like to thank the management at 3AW in Fairfax. Thanks for leaving me alone. Long may it last. Thanks to the Herald Sun for the privilege of being in print. Thanks to all those I've worked with in newspapers, radio, television, who really cared. We made mistakes, but you're going to do that if you're going to achieve something. And I'd really like to thank those in my audience who continually, God bless them, find ways to remind me not to take myself too seriously. And just a final thought, Justin suggested this to me. Think back to Graham Perkin's words 40 years ago, and I hope that can go on the website. Apply this to journalism as we begin another 40 years of challenge. I mean, this is something to keep us thinking, keep us aware of the dangers of that junk journalism. There's a habit in the United States of saying when confronted with an ethical dilemma, actually I should say of the evangelists, who I don't normally recommend, but their slogan is WWJD. You've got a dilemma, WWJD. It's what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus, chap, I don't know, but when we face the questions and challenges in this business today, we face the doubts about our credibility, and we are on the nose, let's face it. Questions about our standing, our role, our audience, challenges to our very survival. We've got to be alert to change and keep thinking and analysing ourselves in the way we operate, which is what Graham Perkin was doing 40 years ago. We could do worse than adapt that evangelical slogan and ask ourselves not what Jesus would do, what would Graham do? Now, I'm not suggesting he was the journalistic messiah, he had plenty of faults, but he was a great journalistic leader, and in the years ahead, we're going to need great leadership. Thanks so much. I really could not be more honoured than to carry an award in the name of Graham Perkin. Thank you.